Father, thank you. Again, what a beautiful weekend. And I just pray that you would be with me as I work through this material, the application, the beginning and ending of our relationship to you. I just pray that you would infuse this conversation this week and next week. In your son's name, amen. So we are, I was telling Renee as I was putting this together, this ended up being about 150% of a lesson. Now my impulse would be to do what? Cram it in. Let's go, baby. Buckle up, Buttercup, and let's move on. But I'm going to be out at the beginning of next week, so we're going to go ahead and make this a two-parter. And this is essentially a follow-up to what we did with Romans, which was applicational. This is the application of Hebrews we're going to go through. But it hits a couple of our other agenda items, word studies and problem passages, because we're going to begin in the fourth problem passage in the book of Hebrews. Again, where Paul and Apollos is, again, my contention is Apollos is the writer of Hebrews, where they will both use unique Greek words. Today's study is absolutely not unique. It is very, very common. And you can see it right there, faith. So we'll begin with this quote I got from a guy named James Boyce. It says, the way of the righteous is the way of faith in God. The way of the wicked is the way of drawing back from faith in God. The first submits to God and trusts God. The second submits to no one. The person who chooses the second way is arrogant. The challenge presented to us in this chapter, which is chapter 11, is that choice. Will it be the world's way, the way of the ungodly with its emptiness, its frustration, and eventual ruin? Or will it be God's way, the way of faith in Him who alone is worthy of that faith? And so for us, we're going to begin with something we did at the introduction, which is Habakkuk 2:4. Now, from the CSB, in the Old Testament, they translated the Masoretic text, basically say, look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity, but the righteous one will live by his faith. So Paul quotes this verse at the conclusion of his introduction to the book of Romans. Chapter 1 through 16 is essentially him talking about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And he is basically going to write the gospel to the Romans. Okay? A group of people he does not know, a group of people who are predominantly made up of proselytes, I think, as we looked at the names in chapter 16. And so from his perspective, he's wanting to make sure that they have the right gospel. Because again, he's seen people like the Galatians who he delivered the gospel to, who then go off and do what? Abandon it, right? So he is laying out in the greatest treatise of the gospel that he's ever going to write, the whole story of the gospel in Romans. And his conclusion of the matter is, the righteous will live by faith. And he quotes Habakkuk 2:4. Now, what's interesting, when we get over to Hebrews, the same verse is quoted, but he quotes more or less the entirety of Habakkuk 2:4. And of course, he starts off by moving the end to the beginning. He says, the righteous one will live by faith. What this comes from is, this is now what? 10:38 puts us where? It's at the end of the book. As he heads into his application. And again, for us, this is why I think is important, is to sit there and say that what's happening in the book of Hebrews is faith is the application. Because again, what's the problem with the Hebrews, the people who are receiving the letter? They're tempted to do what?
Fall back into the law.
That's exactly right. So he quotes this because, yeah, faith is important, but his quote references the two components of the Habakkuk line. So we're going to I got some more stuff about faith and stuff down here if you want to take a look at it in the notes, but we're going to begin with this. And so we're going to look at the word faith in both of its forms. And I'm terrible at pronouncing anything, and so I'm really good at pronouncing Greek words, but pisteo, which is the verb form of faith, you'll notice that it is used 98 times in the book of John. That may be hard to see, but that sucker goes all the way out to there. Nobody else uses the verb form of faith more than John, almost 100 times. You'll notice the top three appear where? They're concentrated. Yeah. John, Acts, and Romans. Okay? Now, we've made some contentions as we've gone through, and I've made my argument to sit there and say that Apollos, who again, we do not know who wrote the book, but I'm going to bet that Apollos wrote it. What do we know about John, Luke, and Paul? Were they ever together in any one spot? Huh?
Paul was losing a lot.
Paul moved a lot, but where did he spend 3 years, for instance? Ephesus, right? Who's with him? Luke, because he sits there and he switches from second person to first person. And again, who else do we have historically being in Ephesus and probably wrote his gospel in Ephesus? John, right? So all these languages tied together. What's interesting, if you go down here into these, what are called the Jewish epistles, James uses the verb form 3 times, Peter 3 times, 2 Peter 0, Jude 1 time. So the word faith used a ton. Matthew himself over here only uses it 8 times. Now, if you go off and take a look at the noun form, interestingly enough, the book of John, Gospel of John, which uses the faith verb 98 times, uses the noun 0. Nobody has faith. Everybody exercises faith in the book of John. Isn't that interesting? But of course, then you go off and you sit there and say, who are the top? The top ones. The top 2 happen to be, guess what? Our books. Romans and Hebrews. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Right? Is that not interesting? Right? And so again, you take a look, Galatians 22 times, because he's dealing with what? People who had the gospel and then have been doing what? Moved back toward Judaism. You who began by the Spirit, are you going to be perfected by the flesh? That's exactly the basic argument that's happening in the book of Hebrews in a lot of ways. And so for myself, when I think through this, one of the things we'll find too as we go through today's study, we're going to see in Hebrews unique words, not just in the New Testament, but literally in Greek literature. The writer of Hebrews is literally making stuff up as he goes along. These words are not found in the rest of the New Testament or the Old Testament. They're not found anywhere else.
So, sorry, just for those who are a little slow, what's the application from this?
So the application for this is to sit there and say, I'm looking at words that are used multiple times, because again, what's going to be interesting about this in the case of Hebrews, these are not just concentrations of this, but it's also going to be in Hebrews, it's going to be concentrated to the specific text that we're going to go off and look at. So part of it is to say, if these 4 gentlemen are around, because we know Apollos is also at Ephesus, right? And I think the book of Hebrews is written to the church at Corinth. Okay? And again, so it keeps all these people in the same milieu. All these people are adopting the same language. They're using the same terms. What we'll find is some of these unique words that are used in Hebrews are used 1 or 2 other places. Like, for instance, in the book of Acts. Okay? Who wrote Acts? Luke, right? They're used in a couple of Pauline epistles. Again, why? Paul and Apollos hanging out together. So part of it is to sit there and say, again, it's another one of these, tenuous threads, but I hold on to these like, a remora. But the idea is to sit there and say that these guys are using similar language, which again tightens in my mind the fact that these books are not at the opposite end of the bookcase, but again belong together.
So it's kind of it's a historical tie-in as kind of a thread to pull.
That's a thread to pull as well.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
By the end of this, you guys will all agree with me, I'm sure.
That always happens.
That always happens, exactly.
I just want to make one other point, that the verb form of faith, we don't use faith as a verb.
Right.
We use it's belief.
It's belief.
That's what it's translated.
Exactly right. So again, that's why when you go backwards this way, again, for the most part, faith and faithfulness is how it's translated, right? That's the noun form, right? Go back up one more. Oops, come on, seriously? There you go. But when you get over here, it's believe, believed, believers, blah, 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 like that. So you're exactly right. Okay. So given that, and one other thing, if you guys remember our class that we did on Matthew, the Gospels, notice again that Matthew, Mark, and Luke hardly use the verb form at all. Interestingly enough, right? Then you go down and you sit there and say, how about on the noun form? Luke more than the others, but again, very, very rarely is faith used in the Gospels outside of the book of John. Stunning to me. Because again, we would sit there and say, we are saved by what? Grace through faith, right? That gift of him, blah, blah, blah. So it's always interesting. So from this point forward, we told you guys we're going to read Hebrews 10:19 through 12:4. And the reason I'm lumping these together is because, again, there is the application, but we also are confronted with this first word in 10:19, which is therefore. So again, this represents, in my mind, sort of the conclusion and a shift toward applicational material at this point. Now, of course, there have been applications in the book of Hebrews to this point because he's dealt with what? We've already talked about. He's dealt with 3 problem passages, and each of the problem passages is a moment in time for him to stop and say, applicationally, check your soul. Are you doing these things, right? But we're now getting to, in my mind, kind of his big conclusion, having laid out his theology, and especially from 7:1 through 10:18, he's now saying, what's the practical application of this? Okay? So he's going to begin by basically focusing on, I'm going to break this section down into these 3 outline points. 10:19 through 39, this exhortation to a lifestyle of faith and faithfulness. And again, one of the things this is why he starts off in 10:38. He has this, the just shall live by faith, because if you remember back to Habakkuk, what is the setup for the book of Habakkuk? Who was Habakkuk, and what was he going through when he writes his prophecy? Anybody remember? Who taught Habakkuk in our minor prophets class? We'll say George. We'll say George since he wasn't here. Actually, it was probably me, but it is what it is. Habakkuk is basically railing against the injustice that he sees around him, right? All the bad bunnies are winning, all the good bunnies are being terrorized, etc., etc. Life is not working well. Habakkuk cries out to God and sits there and says, how long, Lord, will this injustice last? God's response is what? I got a solution for you, brother. It's the Chaldeans. They're going to come and kill everybody. Habakkuk's response is, whoa, time out. That's the wrong answer. Sort of a deal, right? And so the book is this very interesting thing, but the important part of this is that this is a book by a man who is crying out against what? This injustice, this violence that he sees, especially against his people who he perceives the righteous ones in particular. How does that apply to Hebrews? What's happening to the recipients of the Hebrew letter? They're being persecuted. Fairly, unfairly. And who's persecuting them again? Not the Romans yet, but the Jews. Exactly right. Okay? And so from their perspective, it seems extraordinarily unfair. But in the same way as Habakkuk, because who is persecuting the innocent that Habakkuk's worried about? It's the leadership of the nation. It's the culture. The tie is utterly the same from that perspective, right? Now, of course, this will then lead into what? The Hall of Faith, chapter 11, which is this very interesting, if you look at it through this lens, I think it'll yield some interesting results for us. And then concludes with another therefore that is not the same Greek word as this therefore that we start off 10:19 with. So we'll get to that at that point next week sometime. Okay? Now, inside the book of Hebrews, back to your question, Chad, the verb form is only used in chapter 4:3 as well as 11:16. So that's the 2 places. So 11:16 obviously incorporates this component here. But the noun form is only used 4 times outside of this conclusion, right? And again, all 30 of the references, 36 of the references to faith happen in this applicational component. So this is obviously he is dumping the word faith on these people again and again and again and again and again. And if you know chapter 11, you obviously know why. So this section begins with all that Christ has done to allow us to enter into the presence of God through faith, ends with a statement about Jesus as the author and perfecter of faith, and so that's the beginning and ending of the broad overview of this. So let's go ahead and have somebody read Hebrews 10:19 through 25. Bless you.
Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.
Great, thank you. So the author supplies the motivational source for exhortations that we're going to get. What are they? We have a great high priest, and through him we have freedom of access to the throne room of God. Now, again, Jesus is firmly managing the affairs of his people, right? This is an echo of 3:1 through 6, so if you want to take some notes here, and a restatement of 4:14's the great high priest. Also, from chapter 4, we possess a superior access to God and his throne of grace, because the Levitical priests had to approach with what? Could they approach with confidence? Could they approach with boldness? Could they approach with, openness and freedom? Fear and trembling, right? What's it's apocryphal because it's not actually in the Bible, but they used to tie a rope to the leg of him for what reason? Yeah, if he dies, they just drag him back out, right? Sort of a deal. That is the opposite of what the writer here is basically sitting there saying to us. We have something that is beyond the dreams of the Levitical priests. How many times a year could they go and see God in his throne room? Once. If you were the high priest and you were of the priestly line, could you do that? So it's one person, one time a year, who approaches with what? Fear and trembling. What is the difference here? We have unlimited, daily, intimate, personal, ever available access to God Most High, made possible because of what? Jesus Christ, the blood of Christ. And so think about the words that we heard today. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. This is the application of it. This is the writer of Hebrews sitting there saying, I understand that verse, and this is what it means, right?
The human high priest is coming not only to attack the people, but himself. He is as unclean as they are.
Yes, exactly right. And that's the whole point of chapter 4 of Hebrews, which we may or may not get to. So, we'll see. Now, again, when he sits there and says this access is fresh, that Greek word is prosphatos. It's a unique word in the New Testament that is inaugurated, again, egkanonzo, which is only used here in 9:18 on our behalf. And of course, as we know, John 4:16, he is the only way. Now, what's interesting is he goes through, remember Paul's known for his what? Faith, hope, and love? Guess what we get here? Faith, hope, and love. Faith, what has changed for us in this area? He sits there and says, our hearts are sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. Both verbs are perfect passive, which means what? It occurred at some previous moment in time, but it has continuing effect. And again, the passive component of it means what? It was done to us by somebody else. Right? It wasn't, I didn't do this myself. I didn't play a role in making this happen. This happened because of somebody else. Now, he uses this ritualistic language, I think, to indicate the justification and positional sanctification that we as believers possess through the application of Jesus' blood to our lives. Okay? Because obviously we have not been sprinkled with the blood of Jesus, right? But the point of it is to sit there and say that that's because of that, because of Jesus' blood, he has inaugurated, he's opened up this way for us. When we think about washing, what do you guys think about when you read that washing component of this? What words come to your mind when you think of the word washing?
Clean. Baptism.
Clean, baptism? Okay, I'm going to pick on the baptism people because that's what I think of first too, right? Our bodies are washed in pure water. We tend to think of what? Baptism, right? Okay, I'm going to basically say I disagree. I want you to write down Ezekiel 36:25, because I think this is an allusion to some of these new covenant provisions. Ezekiel 36:25 says, I will also sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and all your idols. Again, there is that same past perfect, passive, past perfect sort of verbs that sit there and say what? I will do this to you. That's the passive part. It will be done. It will still have what? Continuing impact on you. So I think he is here referencing not baptism as much as what Ezekiel is talking about with the New Testament, or with the New Covenant. Hope, our next one, right? In verse 23, the confession of our hope. Now again, this is also a restatement of language from chapter 3 and chapter 4. So if you want to note chapter 3 verse 6 and 16, chapter 4 verse 14. So a restatement of some of that previous language. Our hope is without wavering. Alkynes, this is another unique word in the New Testament. So is our faith without wavering? Jeremy opened it up this morning. Was sitting there saying, so some of you did really well yesterday. Some of you didn't. Some of you are a mixed bag, right? I'm going to assume most of us are mixed bag people, right? So by definition, does that mean our faith is unwavering? No. It means our faith wavers, right? He's calling us to something greater than that. How in the world do we combat the wavering? What's the answer here?
Hope.
It's not hope. It's not hope. Our hope is based on something else. What is the focus that we need to have in order for our faith to not waver? Him. Exactly right. It's Jesus, right? We can hold fast because the object of our hope, Jesus, is somebody who does what? He never lets us go, right? Every time we look at him, he is looking back at us. He doesn't turn his back on us in any way, shape, or form. He has the same hope, the same certainty that we will be found complete in him. So every time that we return our gaze to him, he is there faithful. And then the last one, love. So again, when you see the word promote in where does it sit there and says, and he sits there and says, in order to promote love and good works. What are some of the other translations that people have in verse 26?
Stir up.
Stir up. Okay. Provoke. I like your translation a lot. What else?
Stimulate.
Stimulate. And who had spur? Spur. I like it a lot. Okay. The reason I like it is because I think promote in the CSB, and I love the CSB translation in a lot of ways. This word is paraximus. What word do we get paraximus from?
Practice.
Not praxis, paroxysm, right? When somebody has a paroxysm, what is that?
I've never heard this word.
You never heard this word? What is a frisson? When all of a sudden you get this weird shiver, right? Something's happened. You get this shiver, right? That's a paroxysm, right? You don't know what's happening. You're just sort of seized by this experience. You convulse. In the Greek, it implies even something that's almost violent in nature, right? It's just like you're just sitting and all of a sudden you just can't control yourself. You've had these moments, right? Where you're just like, oh, what happened? Just some sort of a shiver that runs through you so hard that you physically can't control it. That's the word that's used here for promote, right? That's why I like spur or some of these other ones. It's the intent of this is it's much stronger than this. I sat there and said this is used here in Hebrews. It's used only in one other place in Acts to describe the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Very interesting, right? Now that sounds negative from that perspective, but what is it? It is this idea of literally the intent is to say, I'm going to jab somebody because I want to cause them to what? Respond, right? If you were to poke Scott in the ribs, what's he going to do?
Poke you back.
But the idea would be to sit there and say he's going to move in some way, shape, or form. That's what this word is. It's much stronger than our translations will go off and leave with us, right? He's trying to sit there and say, that's why I like spur. It's trying to get us to do what? Move in some way, shape, or form. Don't sit there. Don't be passive. So we get into 10:26 through 31. Again, he says, if we deliberately sin after receiving the knowledge of truth, there's no longer remaining a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment, the fury of a fire about to consume the adversaries. If anyone disregards Moses' law, if anyone disregards Moses' law, he dies without mercy, based on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think one will deserve who has trampled on the Son of God, regarded as profane the blood of the covenant by which he is sanctified, and insulted the Spirit of grace. Right? He goes on and says, we know the one who has said, vengeance belongs to me, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. This is our last of our problem passages, right? And of course, it arises out of this immediate discussion about faith. And the pressure to buckle under persecution, to give into the external pressure that they're faced with in their own, what they would have considered their own community, right? The internal doubts and fears that they have would prove to be what? According to this, a most perilous course. Now, of course, this is all complementary to what we see in 6:4 through 6. This is just a more impassioned and a kind of a more exuberant example of that same impulse in 6:4 through 6, because he has just finished up with the fact that we have this better access through this better high priest in 7 through 10. Okay? So he has amped up the theology so he can amp up the warning. Now, what goes off and sits there and says, the author has basically expressed these concerns before. So this is the other 3 problem passages, and we will look at problem passages on their own. But again, he's centered, in 2:1 through 4, he's centered on them drifting away from their trust. This is the danger that they face. Them following their rebellious and doubtful ancestors in 7 through 4:13, and then of course their stubborn refusal to trust God's power to deliver them in 6:4 through 6. Once this habit forms, the possibility of a decisive sin, this idea of falling away, becomes almost inevitable. And what he's saying is that once it's committed, yes, it can be forgiven, but it cannot be undone. Right? There's a consequence of doing so. The shift backward would put them back into the physical discipline that is talked about when he sits there and says, insulted the Spirit of grace. What is that a reference to? Put your little note there, Matthew 12:30 through 32. That's the unforgivable sin, right? So again, they're in this position that they're going to be judged for this sin. And again, he sits there and says the gravity of this warning is highlighted by the repetition of this word terrifying, phoboros, which is again unique to the book of Hebrews. So, we go on through it. Let's talk about this word right here, this intentional sin. Okay? This word appears only here and in 1 Peter. It is, in the Greek, the first word of the sentence, so therefore it's the most emphatic. It's the one that's supposed to grab your attention right off the bat. And what it stands for is a conscious, intentional, deliberate attitude that displays contempt for God and His Word. Right? You've told me not to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Right? And so, from their perspective, to abandon the Christian faith was first and foremost a theological denunciation of their Christian confession. That's that same type of confession that we see that Paul mentions in his Romans area, where he says, if you believe with your heart, confess with your mouth. And we think to ourselves, well, that's not such a big deal. It is if you end up in the situation the Hebrews are in. Right? To confess, to be baptized, was to exclude yourself from the community and to put yourself at the risk that these people are going through, and he's having to write a letter to tell them to hang on to with, right? The second is this declaration that somehow Messiah's ability to save us just isn't sufficient. Why? Look at my life. It sucks. You know? I'm not seeing the joy of being a Christian because my life is what? Terrible. Think about the letter to the second church in the 7 churches. You're poor, but I tell you you're not. Well, that's great, but I'm still poor, right? From that perspective, that's one of the ways that they're going off and looking at this, right? And then third, this endorsement for their preference of the Mosaic covenant over the new, which he's already referenced. I think that's why the Ezekiel passage helps us with the washing with pure water, because he is pulling this in with that concept as well. Now, here's the important thing about this, right? To abandon the Christian faith is basically to sit there and say, I want to live under the law. And of course, those who live under the law, what happens to them? What does the book of Romans tell us? Yeah, if you live under the law, you're perishing under the law. There's no getting around that, right? Interestingly enough, he picks up on that here because Torah provided no provision for those guilty of willful, deliberate sins. So anything committed with a rebellious or high-handed attitude under Numbers 15:29 through 31, Numbers 15:29 through 31, resulted in a death penalty. Idolatry, murder, adultery, blasphemy, all carried the death penalty. There are no Levitical sacrifices for fixing a crime of that magnitude. Does that make sense? You screw up with some other things, yeah, you can offer up some sacrifices, blah, blah, blah. These kinds of things always resulted in what? Capital punishment. And the writer of Hebrews is applying that to their specific situation. If under the Mosaic covenant, the result is a death penalty, how much more so under the new covenant? Is it worthy of a death penalty? Now, here's what's interesting about this, though, right?
And that's because under the new covenant we have more truth revealed, so therefore we're more responsible.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as that. Exactly right. And again, I think the other thing with this too is that under the Mosaic covenant, you were never given any help as far as obeying it, right? In the new covenant, what do we have? The Holy Spirit, right? And you're squatting on everything that He's done for you, sort of a deal, right?
So as I was reading this in preparation for it, I got stuck up on Hebrews 10:16, and they were talking about the covenant He makes with them, and how I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. When you go back to Deuteronomy 11, you read it, it's all, if you do this, if you do this, if you do this. So
that's exactly right.
The impetus is upon, back in Deuteronomy, is upon the hearer of the law. It's your job to do it.
Yep.
You're doing it. And here, it's I'm doing it.
Right.
And I'll put my law in your heart, and you will do because I've done something.
That's exactly right. And again, that goes back to those past, passive, present, sort of verbs, right? That sit there and say somebody's done something to you in the past that has lingering effects. It's that change of heart. It's the realization of the new covenant, even if it's just a down payment, which is, of course, their problem. Paul will sit there and say in Ephesians, the Spirit is given to us as what? Is He the complete? As soon as we get the Spirit, everything's golden. I'm like glorified. I never sin anymore. Everything's good to go. He's what? He literally, the word's down payment. Okay? If I ever wonder about, do I possess this? Yeah, all I need to go and see is the escrow account that has my name on it. Which means what? I have the title and the deed. I just don't have it in my possession, but it's coming because why? It's sure and secure. That's these people's problem. They keep thinking, well, I'm supposed to have the full benefit. Nope, all you got was the down payment.
You just get the hope.
I've got the hope, but the hope is certain, not uncertain, right?
So Thomas, when it says willful, deliberate sin.
Yep.
Is that speaking to specific sins, or is it speaking to a broader sin nature?
We're going to get to the sin in just a bit, so I think he's going to answer that question for us in just a little bit. So, good question, but hang on that for just a moment, because we're going to get to a definite article in a bit. Okay? Now, this when he sits there and says, I got to make sure I'm in the right spot. Okay, here he goes. When he sits there and says, it's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God, what does that mean? Well, if you go back to the 2 Samuel, this is David. David sins by calling for a national census. Y'all remember this story? And then he is presented with 3 punishments. You get a choice, A, B, or C. David, what would you prefer? What was David's response to A, B, or C? D. I'll take falling into the hands of the living God. David's response was, I don't choose A, B, or C, I'm choosing D. I throw myself on the mercy of God. That's what this guy's talking about here, right? He's not sitting there saying, oh, fall into the hands of God, who's going to do what? I love the sermon. Sinners in the hands of an angry God is just one of the great sermons of all time, okay? But the problem is that concept sticks in our head when we read this. We should be thinking what David was thinking in 2 Samuel, okay? Now you have to ask yourself again, and he lays it out here for us. When he sits there and says, how much worse? It's a rhetorical device to go from the lesser to the greater. The Jews love this thing, right? This is why I make the argument that Isaiah 40 through 48 is not 49 through 55, because it's an argument from the lesser to the greater, Cyrus to the real Savior, Jesus, right? So here he's doing the same thing. He's going from the lesser to the greater. So if Jesus is superior to Moses, the new covenant greater than the Mosaic covenant, then it stands that the punishment for violating the greater would be much worse than violating the lesser. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is worse than death?
Eternal death.
That's exactly, eternal death. That's where our mind goes. Okay? But that's not his point. Okay? What's the promise of the, remember, it's right in here, what's the promise of the unforgivable sin? It occurs because it's a what? Is it an individual sin or a national sin? It's a national sin. What's going to be the result of the implementation of that punishment?
A drop in the word of the Lord and getting his spirit removed from you, right? Like that's what happened to Saul, right?
No, that's true. That's back then. But in this specific case, we're contextualizing it to the New Testament. When Titus rolls into
Right.
Jerusalem, what's the results?
Devastation.
Utter devastation, right? So what's worse than an individual death? How about hundreds of thousands? Or in some counts, 1 million people dying, right? The loss of the temple. This beautiful temple, utterly razed to the platform. Not a stone left on another, as Jesus would sit there and say. The city burned. 100,000 Jews taken to Rome in chains from Judea. It's a long walk, right? According to Josephus, the conquest of Judea, the destruction of Jerusalem, was the most catastrophic war recorded to date. That's how bad he saw it. How terrible it was. And of course, Steve did the thing on, I just lost Jeremiah's book on Lamentations. And how terrible, when you read through how terrible that was, to think that it was probably worse in the 70 AD battle that they went through, right? So what's worse here than the death of the individual is the loss of the nation. The hope that they had from the Maccabean revolt, that Jews are running this situation, and now they're under the boot of the Romans, but they still have some autonomy, right? Now, all gone. Wiped out completely. This is where he's going with this. But, and we have this great contrast to what has just been said. So somebody read for us 32 through 39.
But remember the former days when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and afflictions, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you also showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted with joy the seizure of your possessions, knowing that you have for yourselves a better and lasting possession. Therefore, do not throw away that confidence of yours which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of our soul.
Perfect. Thank you. So again, that part where he sits there says, you have endured hard struggle with sufferings. The question is at whose hands? And again, our answer has always been what? The Jews. They're brothers, right? The writer turns to the language of sport to basically create an analogy for them. The word he sits there and says, when he goes off and sits there and says, you have struggled, that word is althesis. It's a grueling wrestling match word. It is uniquely used here in the New Testament, so used nowhere else, right? Of course, what he's basically saying is that you've been made a public spectacle. The word here is theatrazo, which is, of course, where we get our word theater from, right? It means to hold up to derision, to hold up to spectacle, to be put on stage, to be stared at, right? They had been publicly mocked and ridiculed, enduring verbal insults, acts of violence, and confiscations. They had expressed passionate solidarity with each other, right? Sympathio, used here and in relation to Jesus in 4:15, means to suffer alongside somebody. And they had demonstrated that they had an attitude of joy, for they had this promise of superior possessions than what they had been stolen from them, right? Again, I'm willing to give up something of very little value. Paul sits there and says, everything I had was rubbish and garbage in view of what? Everything that was to come. Okay? And so for them, they understood that. They had demonstrated these things, right? And they understood that this eschatological reward was conditioned upon their obedience right now. And of course, I think that all echoes what Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount, where he sits there and commands people, store up treasures. Where what? Thieves cannot get in and steal. Exactly the situation these people are going through, right? Then he goes off and he sits there and says, their great reward. This is a unique word. Misthopodesia. A word only appears here in Hebrew in 2:10:35 and 11:26. Now again, literally that word is unique to the entire Greek-speaking world when he coins it. He will use it 3 times in Hebrews. We'll talk about it more a little bit later on. But highlight that word, great reward. And then, of course, we talked about it at the beginning. He goes back to Habakkuk 2:4. We are not those who draw back. That's his conclusion of this, right? We live by faith, and we are not those who draw back. Hypostole. This is another truly unique word. This is not a word that's found anywhere else in Greek literature at this time. This is the application the author wants the readers to focus on. Faith is the answer to living through what is going on today. How do you not draw back? You have what? Faith. So again, I would sit there and suggest one more thing, going back into the words thing. Why start with all the Greek words? Why talk about all these other places it's used? My count, as I look from 19 through 39, there are 6 words in the Greek that are literally found nowhere else in Greek literature. Now, if you're making a conclusion to a very important argument to your audience, do you want to make up 6 words to drive that conclusion home? Especially to people who don't read and understand Greek very well. People whose first language would be what? Say Aramaic, who live in Jerusalem and Judea? No, I'm sorry. This person's obviously demonstrating fantastic rhetorical skills and an amazing flourish of $10 words at the end, right? Who is he writing to? Who has to be hearing this? Greeks, people who understand the Greek language incredibly well, which tells me these people live outside of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria.
But Jewish ones, right?
They are exactly right, because we've talked about the reader. These people are what? Proselytes. In the same way that the Roman recipients are also Greek, but proselytes. Exactly right. And so, again, this for me, knowing what Corinth is, this fits that group of people, if that makes sense. So again, I just like piling on my evidence. Because I know you guys just don't, let nobody doubt me. So let's turn to the Hall of Faith. And we're going to start in this, and then we'll stop before too long on this deal. But we're going to get into a couple of things on this. So I want to ask you this question. Why does this chapter's material immediately follow what we have just covered? Why is it related? Is it related? Or is this just some excursus that the writer's going through?
These are people who went through the same thing.
Hello? Exactly right. This is Paul. You've heard people sit there and say, what's my testimony? Blah, 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 right? Paul's testimony that so we have him getting his conversion in Acts in chapter 9, but how many more times do we hear about his conversion story? 2 more times. It's ridiculous. It's an entire chapter in Acts, and we get to hear almost the entire story 2 more times. But the last time is he's giving his testimony in front of who? Y'all remember? It's at the temple, in front of a whole bunch of Jewish people who think he's brought in a Gentile into the temple against the commands. Now, his whole point of this testimony ends with what? As I was, you are also. As I am, you can be also. That's the point of the word testimony. That's why this is here. As they were and became heroes of the faith, so are you, and you can be as they are. That's the point.
Back to Romans where where he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel.
That's exactly right. And that's what he's calling these people to sit there and say, they weren't, these people in chapter 11 were not ashamed of their faith. Don't be either. So with that set up, we go off and sit there and say, verse 11, 1 through 2, basically says, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not as seen, and for this our ancestors were approved. For by this our ancestors were approved. I've highlighted 5 unique or key Greek words. Pistis, which is again that word belief, faith. This is the confident belief directed toward the Lord, specifically trust and reliance in his ability to do what? From their perspective, not what he's done in the past, it's what he's going to do in the future. Are you going to fulfill your promises to us? Yes, that's what his faith is focused on. Now again, faith is not optimistic fruit of imagination. It is an extrapolation. It is a belief. It's realistic because it's a belief that because God has done this in the past, he is capable of doing what? That in the future. Okay? And that's super important for these people because we're going to see that this to that is the whole movement, one of the big themes in chapter 11. Hypostasis, of its 5 appearances in the New Testament, 3 of them occur in Hebrews, and it's best translated as substance or essence or nature. It is the foundational basis or the grounding substance from which all of our assurance will go off and flow. Elpizo, which is hope. The object of hope in Hebrews is the fulfillment of God's promises. What are we hoping in? That God will fulfill his promises to us. Elagos, properly translated is proof or conviction. This word's only used twice in the New Testament. The second one in 2 Timothy 3:16. Martyreo, the primary definition means what? Witness. In the aorist passive tense, it's best understood as they received a testimony. Okay, chapter 11 is, after all, testimonials of everybody who's operated their lives by faith. And so, a amplified version of this would read something like this. Now faith, the confident belief in God's ability to carry out his express purpose, is the substance, the foundational basis or essence underlying any attitude of assurance of that which is hoped for, our certain expectation that God will make good his promises. The personal conviction that what is present at present not yet personally seen, enjoyed, or grasped, will nonetheless become the objective reality in the future. This is the testimony of our predecessors of faith. These are the two most important verses practically in the entire book, right? And built on all of this because this is the turning point for these people. He's calling them, given everything I've said, do you understand this? Because if you do, you will stay to the end. So the basic outline of chapter 11 looks something like this as he works his way through, plucking examples out of the scrolls of the Old Testament. And again, looking at people who, in particular, their faith was future-oriented. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, because this chapter is clearly unique in the Bible, right? There's just nothing else like it. And we've had plenty of people who do what? They recount history. We read through Psalm 74, I mentioned Acts 7, blah, blah, blah. There's been these historical recountings. Interestingly enough, I think that I had this guy mention this, and I went off and took a look at it. He mentioned this could be modeled after First Maccabees. Intertestamental books were important, and most of the Jews read through them. In fact, we get a quote from one in Jude, right? But they're not worthy of being canonized. But just listen to this one from Maccabees. He says, remember the deeds that our ancestors performed in their generations, and you shall win great honor and everlasting renown. Was not Abraham found faithful when he was put to the test, and it reckoned to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept God's law, and he became the Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our ancestor, because of his burning zeal, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua, for carrying out his commission, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, he mentions Caleb, David, Elijah, Hanani, Azariah, Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for their faith. Daniel, blah, blah, blah. And he goes all the way down through this same kind of list. He's basically taking people and plucking them out to make his argument stronger. So the writer of Hebrews could have read through this and said, it's got a nice rhetorical shtick, and we'll run with it. So we'll look at a couple of these real quick here, and then we'll bail out on this and move on to next week. So Hebrews 11, 5 through 6. By faith, Enoch was taken away, and so he did not experience death. He was not to be found because God took him away. For before he was taken away, he was approved as one who pleased God. Now, here's the other verse that relates back to 1 and 2. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So I think this list illustrates what the author had in mind when he mentioned the men of old who received a testimony. He adds this one last element regarding faith as he discusses Enoch, whose faith in righteousness is so great that he basically bypasses death. And he categorizes faith as having two absolute elements. One must believe in the existence of God, as well as that for those who seek him, he is a rewarder. Again, that's a second use of that word misanthropates, or reward. That is somebody who is characteristically and reliably in the business of keeping his promises. Right? The author is trying to encourage his brothers to avoid losing heart as they suffer under pressing and miserable circumstances. Because why? This is who God is. He is reliable about rewarding those who seek him. This is the business that he is in. In 8 through 10, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents as Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he, Abraham, was looking forward to a city that has its foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Right? So again, God's promises required the patriarch to possess a long-term perspective. Because in the short term, in the spans of Abraham, who leads a long life, Jacob and Isaac, all three of these guys who live a lot longer than we're probably all going to live, did anything tangible result from any of the promises that God gave them? Except for their own obedience to him. Did they get the land? Did any of them see themselves become a great nation? Did any of them see themselves be a blessing to the rest of the world?
They saw it in the distance, but they never experienced it.
That's right. And do you see how that applies to the people in Hebrew who are reading this book in Hebrews? They've got promises that look what? Way out there in the distance, right? And again, of course, this is the whole thing, right? Since nothing of theirs was received, he's sitting there saying, look, here's what's crazy. That promised land, that's just an appetizer. The main course is still to come. And he lays it out specifically because he will use this term, the city, 3 times in Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 10, verse 16, verse 22. What is this city? Well, he tells us specifically, right? He goes, we do not have an enduring city here. Instead, we seek the one to come. What's the one to come? The New Jerusalem. What's the interesting thing? We saw this 2 weeks ago or in the sermon. Y'all remember Wayne showed a picture of the globe? It had a little box on it. What's the little box sitting on the globe? The New Jerusalem. That's craziness. That sucker is 1,500 miles cubed. It's a Borg ship sitting on the Earth, right? For you Star Trek fans, right? Okay? Now, this is the thing. This is the transcendent city of cities, the apex of architectural realization, whose designer, technitus, and builder, Demiurgus, again, unique words in the New Testament, is God. You think about the Saudi Arabians who are building the Line City, right? Unbelievable ambition to try and build something that big and that long, right? This city puts it all to shame. Because you can't breathe past the, whatever it is, 170th floor, right? How do you enjoy the top deck of this thing, right? The laws of physics have to change. Is God capable of that? Because it's the new heavens and the new earth, baby. It's all new, right? Again, this is what they're looking. It says here that Abraham is looking forward to something like that long before we ever have any promise that that's what's coming, right? This is what he's talking about. You Hebrews have got to have that kind of vision. You say you're of Abraham, have his faith. Same thing that we'll hear in Paul sit there and say, right? Hebrews 13 through 16. right? They all died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised. They saw them from a distance, greeted and confessed they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Okay, again, Abraham and his family saw none of the things that were basically promised to them. Okay, Apollos goes off and makes this argument, right, to sit there and say, look, rather than thinking that in terms of a delay in the realization of these covenant promises is a reason to doubt, a reason to go back to in his case, right? They didn't shake their faith. Instead, they did what? They recognized who they were. Oops, go one more. They were this: strangers and exiles. Who are the Messianic Jews living in these cities who have been excommunicated by their brothers? Again, John 12, 42 through 43. We've quoted out of John 12 before. Nevertheless, many did not believe in Jesus, even among the rulers, because of the Pharisees. They did not confess him, so that they would not be banned from the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. What word shows up in John that's the hinge of this whole thing? They believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess. We saw that word used here in chapter 10. We see Paul use that word in Romans, right? We just think, oh, it's easy. Just say whatever you need to say. That's not the point, right? And again, when you go forward with this, right, never looking back in verse 15 and 16, where he sits there and says in chapter 11, 15 and 16, he goes off and says, if they were thinking about where they came, they would have had an opportunity to return, but now desiring a better place, a heavenly one, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. They've never looked back. They never assumed that their homeland would be theirs to enjoy without a future resurrection. They never looked back, but that's a great contrast to what? Chapter 3 and 4, the Exodus generation wants to do what? Every time it gets a little bit rough and tough for them, what's their favorite thing to say? Oh, wish we were in Egypt. Could we go back to Egypt, right? That song, I'm out in the desert, I'm painting pictures of Egypt, leaving out what it lacked, right? Because why? I long to go back. It's a great contrast to this current generation who is being called, who in their minds is being tempted to do what? Go back. That's the individual sin. I don't know that we're going to get to it just yet, but that's the answer to your question, Turner. This is the sin that he's talking about.
Lot's wife, right?
Huh?
Looking back, Lot's wife.
Yeah, another great example, right? Of somebody who's doing what? I'm longing for the past, right? And so this is the contrast that he's trying to get them to understand. They cannot return to Pharisaical Judaism in any way, shape, or form. So with that, we'll wrap up this week. Next week is quiz time. While I'm in there making a fool of myself, you guys will be in here making fools of yourselves. So it's going to be, all be nice and balanced from that perspective. Sure. You can bring one book. Sure. So
Never choose the open book test.
Yeah, exactly right. If you want it to be open book, I'm changing my questions. And then we'll get back into looking at the rest of chapter 11, and then why chapter 12, 1 through 4 is the conclusion of chapter 11. So, all right. Any questions real quick? Do we have time for questions? We don't. One question. Any questions? Perfect. No questions. I love it. That worked out exceedingly well. All right. Let me pray. Father, first, thank you for the gift of faith. Thank you that you've done a work in us and for us that we had no chance of doing. And so we're grateful for that. But Lord, you have then given it to us to exercise. And Lord, I pray that we would, especially this week, as we think about what you have written here, and we think about what's to come, just help us to live into our faith and to exercise it, demonstrate it, and be grateful for it this next week. In your Son's name, amen.